All of a sudden got very quiet in here. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a snowy day. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Janine Davidson. I'm the president of MSU Denver. I love saying that. So thanks again for coming for this fireside-style chat with our esteemed guests, former Colorado governor and current U.S. Senate candidate, John Hickenlooper. Thank you, Governor, for coming today. I'm so excited to welcome you. You are the first in our series of fireside chats with all the 2020 U.S. Senate candidates in Colorado. And we've extended invitations to all the candidates, and we hope to do this and host them all in the coming months with the aim of facilitating a very thought-provoking, informative dialogue for the future of our state and indeed our country. As a former governor, you know the drill of this format. And those students who may not know that he was a former governor, there's a couple other things you might want to know about our esteemed guest. Before that, he was mayor of Denver, and going back even a little further, he was a small business owner and a brewer. And this is where I'm going to plug MSU Denver. You know that you can major in beer at this university. We have an on-campus brew pub, the Tivoli. And we have award-winning brewers there, so I think you should feel at home here. But in all seriousness, today's conversation is actually an opportunity for Governor Hickenlooper to answer some questions about his positions and about how they will affect the future of Colorado as he pursues a seat in the U.S. Senate this year. As one of our leading public universities here in Colorado, we place high value on the exchange of ideas and recognize the importance of open and respectful dialogue. MSU Denver students actually are more politically engaged than the norm. We had 70% turnout rate, and we actually won a national award in 2016. That in 2018, we were 70%, so I think that's pretty awesome, don't you guys? The national average is actually only 55%. So I know our students are excited to have you here today and are also watching on the live stream. Joining us today and leading the Q&A is Danielle Holmes. She's our student government assembly president, and raise your hand there, Danielle. There she is. And Dr. Katia Campbell, she's the president of our faculty senate. Now, before we get started, let me just explain the format. The questions were solicited actually in advance from the students and the attendees. That's how the candidates want this. So while we won't be having live Q&A, we did get dozens of fantastic questions that we will be choosing from today, and I think you'll see a full range of topics, so it's awesome. We'll start with a 5-minute opening from the governor, and he'll also have the opportunity to give 5 minutes of closing so he can get back at anybody who said the wrong thing. And so thank you again for being here. Over to you, Governor Hickenlooper.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Davidson, and let me just say everything I hear about Metro State is so positive, and the energy you're helping to create and the team you've assembled, because an institution like this doesn't evolve naturally. It's by nature chaotic. But you need someone at the top and a team of people at the top that help direct that energy to get the maximum impact. And the level of integration in the school and the community is, and the kids, the cross-section of kids, as I say, kids of all ages, not trying to, I'm not going down that road. Let me give you 5.
Turn that other mic off so you can,
Oh, is that what?
I think it's feedback, yeah. Go ahead, just keep talking.
I was feeling I was going to have a Jimi Hendrix flashback. Let me give you, because I know some of you are young enough that probably don't know much about me, and it is kind of good reference point for people that are in school trying to figure out which direction you want to go. Because I grew up outside Philadelphia. My mom was widowed twice before she turned 40. And I grew up, in a house that recognized you couldn't control what came at you, but my mother always said, what really mattered was how you responded. And I went off to college, not sure what I wanted to do or be. I was an English major and a creative writing major. And my senior year, my friends told me how bad I was. Basically, they said I sucked. And simultaneously, and luckily, I fell in love with geology and the study of rocks and the earth. Got a master's and came out to Colorado. Had a choice of Houston or Colorado. Couldn't really decide. I think it took 11 minutes. Came out here and just loved it from the very beginning. Unfortunately, after 5 years, and I had a master's my whole career as a geologist, that long intermittent recession in the 1980s, commodity prices plummeted, and basically thousands and thousands of geologists got laid off, and no one was hiring. So I was out of work from 1986 till the end of 1988 for a little over 2 years, and ended up, I couldn't find a job as a geologist. I had to go through that process like so many Americans did in the 80s and the 90s, steel workers, auto workers. I had to create my own future, and I ended up opening, some of you have been to the Wine Coop Brewing Company. That was my baby. I opened that when the rent in Lodo was $1 a square foot per year. That's how abandoned it was. And then we worked with all the other restaurant owners there to really try and envision what that neighborhood could be and what it could mean to the city. And after a few years, and we were working 60, 70 hours a week, we paid ourselves, literally it worked out to about $3 an hour, just because we worked such long hours, and we paid ourselves 24 grand a year those first couple years. Eventually it took off, and we opened restaurants in historic buildings in downtowns across the country. And suddenly I didn't have to work as hard, and I ran for mayor of Denver in 2003, I'd never even run for student council. But I thought that there was a connection between all the problem solving you do in small business and really what local government should be at its best. And too often I think local government and state government and federal government, sometimes decisions are made to benefit the elected officials rather than the people they're there to serve. We went and worked with all the suburban mayors who historically had hated the city of Denver. We got everyone to work together to create Fast Tracks, which was 122 miles of new light rail track, the most ambitious transit initiative in modern American history. We got all 34 mayors unanimously to support a tax increase. Now, 2/3 of those mayors were Republicans or conservative independents, and yet everyone came on board. And those of you who take the train out to the airport or from Union Station or come to school on light rail, that's what happens when you work together. And that animosity between the city and the suburbs and the city and the rest of the state was so long lasting and had been there for so long, I didn't realize. I ran for governor in 2010. When I got elected, I became the first Denver mayor in 120 years to get elected governor of Colorado. And we did the same thing. We went out across the whole state and said, we're gonna get everyone to work together. We want to be the most pro-business state, but with the highest environmental standards, the highest ethical standards. We want to reinvent how people participate in this economy. We made a pledge that the rural areas wouldn't be left behind, and pretty much we delivered on that. We'll be the first state to have broadband in every city and town by the end of next year. We have we're the #1 economy in the country according to U.S. News and World Report, but we're also one of the top 3 rural economies. And that's, again, that function of getting everybody to work together. I ran briefly for president. As I tell my wife, I did get to 2%. But I became persuaded that the real opportunity for someone like me is to go back to Washington. And that was the opposite of what I always thought. But Washington's broken. And I'm sure a lot of the questions we're about to go into, your mind will go and just to how dysfunctional Washington has become. And I think part of the reason is people like myself that were successful in small business and have real experience in small government, state government, we're the ones who are supposed to go back and actually try to make, in many cases, the most important decisions facing our country and sometimes facing the world. And the more I thought about that, it seemed that was what I really needed to do. That would be where I would be most excited and most useful. So we announced a couple months ago. I love it. I have to say, once you get into looking at what the Senate could be, it's probably the most exciting thing I've ever taken on. And I say this all the time. I'm 50 times more excited about running for the U.S. Senate than I ever was when I ran for mayor or governor, which were great jobs, and I love them. But this is just, partially I love when they tell you that something's impossible, that you're never going to be able to save Washington. Oh yeah? Oh yeah? Anyway, thank you all for being here. Thank you guys for being the future of this country and the future of the state, obviously. and for all your hard work. And I'll finish this little introduction with just the point of, you can't control what happens to you, just like my mother couldn't control. And I had to learn a new career to become a restaurateur and be in the hospitality industry. And then I ended up having to learn a whole different way of thinking about things to go into local government. But that's the greatest part of life, is learning new things and having to work with whole new teams of people and new networks. And Dr. Davidson knows that first class now for the last year and a half. I mean, that is the richest part of life, and I think all of you are going to be doing it. I think our economy is changing so fast, so we're all going to have to be learning new skills all the time and be ready for new opportunities. Anyway, thank you for being here.
And thank you for coming to campus today, Governor Hickenlooper. Danielle and I are really excited today to talk to you about some issues that are particularly impacting us as MSU Denver students and faculty and staff, but also issues that impact all of us as people in Colorado. So we'll just dive right in,
Okay,
all right?
right.
All right.
I brought my Metro State.
So the first question, MSU Denver students receive the least amount of per pupil funding from the legislature. What will you do to bring additional resources from the federal government to MSU Denver to help offset this increasing disparity?
Well, I'll say just first, and this is endemic in the country, is that kids are leaving getting their degree and being buried in debt. And it makes it hard to start a family, hard to buy a house, hard to really engage in creating your own version of the American dream, whatever that may be. And I think that the federal government I think we should increase look at the Pell Grants, start with the Pell Grants, but there are a whole number of federal scholarship programs that could be expanded or broadened in case of the Pell Grants and be more useful. I think we should look at how the federal government can help restrain the cost that universities have to incur to give a good education. And this is finding ways where the federal government can make it easier to get faculty or maybe provide compensation for faculty members in certain critical research areas, things like that. It's funny, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, people don't always think about this, but when they support someone doing medical research, they'll send them to CU or to MIT or wherever, or Metro State, but they pay all their research, they pay for their laboratory, they pay for pretty much everything, and that person teaches. So those are the kinds of things that one can do. I also think the debt, what business is it? I mean, the federal government's involved in these loans, and that they should ever be 7% and 8% and 9%, I think is an outrage at a time when almost everybody is borrowing money at 2% or 3%. Why is it that of all the debts we take on in life, the one you can't refinance is to those people that are going to have the hardest time making payments, right? Is your student debt. If you go bankruptcy, you can't use the process of bankruptcy to diminish that debt. So I think the federal government should assume those debts at a much lower interest rate. And I think that kids also should be able to have the right, if you're willing to work in a high needs area, whether that's in rural areas or in urban areas, you should be able to work off some of that debt as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, speaking about resources, what do you plan to do to improve access to higher education for DACA students?
Yeah, and when I was governor, we passed the asset bill, which allowed in-state tuition for all DACA, all undocumented individuals. But I think it's more, I think the right answer for that is, let's fix the problem, right? I mean, the kids who are DACA, they don't have another country to go home to. Most of them came here before they were old enough to really recognize, whether they were from Asia or South America or wherever, they didn't adapt and connect and get to be raised in their formative years in that country. They're Americans. In almost every case, they are as American as any of us in this room. And, it's long overdue. President Obama started this, but it's classic. Why is it that Washington can't fix something where almost everybody agrees? Right now, the polls I see, 75% of the American people support citizenship for DACA students. Michael Bennett. Michael Bennett was my first chief of staff, and now he loves the idea that I might be the junior senator. But anyway, he worked on a bill with John McCain that was going to be able to make sure that DACA students got a pathway to citizenship and had appropriate protections. Again, John McCain, Michael Bennett, there are enough people enough senators to pass it. But Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, the Republicans' majority leader in the Senate, refused to allow it to come to the floor. And the guy I'm running against, Cory Gardner, supported that. And I think that's one of the real challenges we face is that they've tied up so many bills that allow us to make progress and solve problems like the unfairness, the inequity to DACA students. The votes are there, we're ready to do it, and yet somehow, for reasons that still I'm not clear on, so obviously fundraising from the base and some of the old political stuff, but for some reason Washington just isn't able to get these things done. I'm going to fix that.
Good, thank you. I look forward to it.
All right, and speaking of inequity, what is your take on legislation affecting women's reproductive health?
All right, so first, let's just say that I support a woman's right of choice no matter what. I second want to say that Planned Parenthood, the people that want to cut funding for Planned Parenthood, should be punished in the court of public opinion and at the ballot box. One of the things I'm most proud of, in Colorado, we had a 5-year grant from the Susan Buffett Foundation. We provided long-acting reversible contraception, so Norplants, IUDs, to any 15 to 25-year-old who requested it. And we reduced unintended pregnancy by 54%, right? And reduced teenage abortion by 64%. In other words, we allowed young women to decide when they want to have a family, when they want to start a family, which again, I think is one of the most basic rights that we should be able to provide. Another thing, if you want to make sure that women have equal access to health care, Cory Gardner wants to undo the Affordable Care Act, wants to force us to roll back our Medicaid coverage. Let's not have any illusions about what that means. That means that in many cases, coverage for women's reproductive health will be completely wiped out for hundreds of thousands of individuals. That we are, also looking at, if you take down the Affordable Care Act, the protections for people with pre-existing medical conditions would be eliminated. And we have in Colorado, and this is a fresh number, 789,000 people who have pre-existing medical conditions of one kind or another, and their protection would be wiped out. And I realize that's on a broader scale than just women, but again, it affects everybody.
Okay, all right. And shifting, but still staying on the topic of women, what legislation do you support that will work on gender equity?
In terms of compensation in the workplace?
In the workplace,
I'm always going to forget the name of the Paycheck Fairness Act. I can't remember now. I've got it wrong. I'm sure there's 20 people out here going, no, it's not the Fairness Fair. There's a bill that needs to be passed and needs to be improved in Congress. That was passed but needs to be improved. That allows us to move much more closely towards to making sure that women get paid on an equivalent level with men. I mean, equal treatment under the law was one of the fundamental premises of this country. And admittedly, we've had a long, bumpy road. For most of this country's history, we have been going oftentimes, not most of, but many times in the wrong direction in terms of making sure that this is a country that treats everyone equally. But equity in terms of gender, right now it's, how can we possibly justify that for doing the same work, a woman makes 86 cents compared to when a man makes $1? And that's a pretty deep inequity. And I think the Payment Fairness Act is a great place to start. We also have to make sure that businesses don't have the right to demand that women say what they got paid at the last job because that's used against them. And some businesses penalize when women talk among themselves and say, well, how much do you make? No, how much do you make? You know, in certain companies, they're not allowed to discuss their compensation because they don't want to have that inequity revealed within the culture of their business. Again, there should be freedom of information. People should be able to talk about how much they're paid or how much their coworkers are paid, you know, whenever they want.
All right, thank you.
Currently, Student Government Assembly has a lawn display that depicts the food and housing insecurities that our students face. What do you plan to do to tackle this issue?
Wow, and you know, someone else mentioned that to me the other day, and I have to make I have to get there to see that. You know, a big part of when you get elected mayor or senator, or governor, what you're dealing with in many cases is those people that have been left behind or marginalized, generally through situations beyond their own control, and you know. Homelessness and hunger are basic, I mean, they are examples of where people's freedom is essentially taken away from them. Because if you're hungry, it's hard for you to study, right? And so if we don't make sure that all kids who can't afford to have breakfast at home, we should try and provide a meal for them at school. If they don't have the sufficient resources to have, you know, bring a lunch or pay for a lunch at school, we should pay for it. Because if a kid's hungry, they can't pay for it. Same thing with housing. I mean, we are, and this is, you know, been going on for a long time. When I got elected mayor, we made chronic homelessness. Now, chronic homelessness is we defined it back then, it's a long time ago, but it's 3 consecutive incidents of going into homelessness. Or one prolonged, I think the definition we used was 9 months continued homelessness, but that became chronic homelessness. And we got the hotels to work with the restaurants, to work with the call centers, to work with the construction industry. The whole downtown community recognized that, you know, homelessness and panhandling on the streets wasn't just bad for those people that were struggling to get through life. It was bad for the you know, what people thought of Denver, whether they'd come here for a convention or a business or open an office here. And we got everybody working together. And for that moment in time, I mean, we reduced chronic homelessness by 75% in 5 years. And it was by getting everyone involved. Then we had the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, and everything got turned upside down. We've got to do the same thing again, is make it a focus. And you need more incentives from the federal government and the state government. Developers, there should be a higher standard when someone's developing apartment buildings in downtown Denver. They should have a pretty firm, you know, minimum. And we can fight over whether it's 10% or 15% or 20%, which is what a number of rapidly growing cities do. That set aside of 10 to 20% for affordable housing is made available to the community. We need more vouchers from the federal government, you know, and it's not just Section 8 vouchers, which are the most well-known ones, but to allow people that are, you know, struggling and working in low-wage occupations to be able to afford housing. Here's the bottom line, is America, I mean, the number we saw in 2005 when we did our study, and then it was basically unchanged in 2013, so I'm going to guess it's pretty much unchanged, that 40% of the homeless population are working at least 30 hours a week. And that's not American, right? If you're working essentially full-time and you can't even afford to pay rent, there's something wrong with the system. So on top of that, I would also say, you know, let's raise the minimum wage, let's push back on the, you know, the earned income tax credit and double that so that working people get a little a refund every year from the taxes that they pay. You know, gets them more money so that they can afford to pay basic rent.
All right, so speaking about, excuse me, debt, do you support student loan forgiveness by the federal government?
Well, as we discussed, I mean, student debt, it's very hard on the individual students. And I've got a number of nephews and nieces that are dealing with this right now. I had an executive assistant who worked for me for 7 years when I was governor, and she'd gotten a master's in photojournalism. She was just turning 40, and she still had $62,000 worth of debt to pay off.
Wow.
And it's just hard to keep a grasp of your future when you're facing with those things. Now, I'm not sure that we want to all, be writing off everybody's debt, and I'm not sure that the children or grandchildren of billionaires should have their debt written off or should have free college. But I do think there should be a sliding scale for how we look at people that are struggling to make ends meet, how they pay for college. In a funny way, that's what we have in terms of things like Pell Grants and the scholarships that are available at an institution like this. But there should be more of that and more support. I think the other part, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that opportunity for people, if they're willing to go work in a high-need area, in a high-need profession, like in an urban area or in a rural area, let's say you're working in healthcare or some form of human services, you should be able to work off some of that debt.
Thanks.
The students here at MSU Denver would like to know, do you support free college?
We'll go back to that previous question. Now, I don't think the children of the Kardashians should have free college. I mean, that was a cheap example, just trying to get a rise. I think that there are other challenges we have rather than free college for everyone. But I don't think, the kids should have to leave college with debts of more than $10,000 or $15,000. And I think that's going to take a committed effort in terms of the federal government and what Congress does, and a committed effort on the universities and making sure that they're doing everything they can, but also the community in which the university operates. In many cases, there's an opportunity for businesses to provide support for students. And we've seen that through a number of kind of work-study programs where people actually, I think Metro State's probably one of the national models for this, of how as you're studying, you're also working and learning skills that will allow you to start off with a little momentum, have a running start when you begin your career. But I don't think it should be free.
Okay. All right, so going a little bit more broadly, can you tell us a little bit about your energy goals for Colorado?
Sure. I think everybody should be high energy and focused. Here's my sense, and I've got a master's in Earth and Environmental Science. I have a very high sense of urgency, and in terms of climate change, that we can't continue to talk about it. We have to act, and we tried to do that. While I was governor, we were able to, we're the first state to get methane regulations. And people don't realize this, that methane, which is natural gas, and at many oil and gas wells, at many pumps and tanks, storage tanks, they would vent it just because it was convenient. The pressure got a little too high. They couldn't handle the pressure. So rather than having stronger tanks, they'd have what they call, they'd have a pressure release valve. They would vent this methane. Methane is 80 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of climate change if it's just vented. And it's a fuel. I mean, the fact that you're venting it and not just at least getting some benefit from the energy in it is an outrage. So just to put it down into a nutshell, we have to go, and I've got a whole plan for this. You can go online, just what everybody wants. Oh my God, another politician with a plan. But I think we need to be, we call it 100 by 50. But 100% net neutral in terms of carbon emissions by 2050. And I think we should be faster than that. I think we have to rejoin the Paris Accords, rejoin the Kyoto Accords, which equally important. We have to get rid of the coal-fired electrical generation plants. We're shutting down 2 coal plants, XL plants in Pueblo, and replacing them with wind, solar, and batteries. For the first time in this country, no natural gas is the transition fuel. And in the process, we've designed it so that the monthly utility bills is going to be lower for the customers than it was under the old coal-fired plants. We also took our Volkswagen fraud money while I was governor and put it towards building the beginnings of a network of rapid recharging stations for electric vehicles. And we called up the governor of Iowa, Governor Herbert, who was a very conservative Republican, but a friend of mine, and convinced him that he didn't want people in electric vehicles driving across Colorado to drive around Utah to get to California. So he agreed to integrate with our network of electric vehicles, and then called Governor Bullock up in Montana, and he said, sure, he'll do the same thing. And then I called Governor Meade in Wyoming. Wyoming is the most carbon-intense energy state in America. And I said, you don't want people going to Yellowstone Park to drive all the way to Idaho and then around up through Montana to get to Yellowstone, do you? And he thought about it for a day, and they're in it too. In other words, we got all 10 Western states to create this integrated system for electrical recharging. These are all the things that are the stepping stones to getting to a sustainable future in real time. But I think the important thing to remember is part of this also is we've got to totally reinvent how we look at international relations, right? We're now turning away. Democrats and Republicans are both saying, well, no more multilateral treaties. These things are too dangerous. I mean, I think that the world's shrinking, right? I mean, we are more and more closely interconnected in so many ways. And whether you're thinking about how many flights there are now everywhere, and that if we get a pandemic like Ebola or something like that, how rapidly it could spread. Things like the protocols around cybersecurity attacks. And we are at war. I mean, people are attacking us right now in terms of cybersecurity. We don't know what the proper response is. But probably most importantly is climate change. We don't, what we do in Colorado, I mean, it's great. We'll make it national best practices in America. Actually, we took methane regulations, and President Obama made them national until Trump and Mitch McConnell and Cory Gardner rolled this all back. But what we do in Colorado is only good so far as it becomes a national model, and that is only good so far as it becomes a global model. And I tell people that we need, I call it a doctrine of constant engagement. We should probably have 50% more diplomats than we had under President Obama, because we should be talking to every country every day about pretty much everything. We are so interconnected, whether we like it or not, especially on issues like climate change, that I mean, it's inconceivable that we're not trying to take the best practices from all over the world and help the entire planet to achieve this goal of true sustainability. So the energy, my vision for the energy of Colorado is sustainable as rapidly as possible, but it's got to go way beyond that.
All right, makes sense.
Well, speaking of sustainability, do you support the Green New Deal?
You know what I worried about in the Green New Deal was there are certain parts of it that I thought would be distractions. I thought it might, and again, lawyers describe the parts that they thought would end up in litigation. I think climate change is so intensely important, and we are so far behind the 8 ball. I mean, we're just a day late and a dollar short, that we have to be laser focused and on issues like getting rid of methane, accelerating the transition to electric vehicles, addressing the issues in industrial emissions. In other words, heavy industry, the emissions, carbon emissions are huge, and yet people aren't really focusing on the innovations and inventions there. So I support the urgency, I support the goals, but I think that as legislation, it would have to be much more laser focused to get through Congress rapidly so we can really make progress in the near future.
Can you talk a little bit about plans that you have to address the opioid epidemic?
And I'm gonna guess there's nobody in this room that doesn't have a family member or a neighbor or a close friend's got a family member who has been through opioid addiction. And it is one of the toughest things in life you go through. And it is an epidemic by any measure. When I got elected governor in 2010, I co-chaired what they call the opioid task force in 2011, 2012. And we did a lot of stuff that is now best practices, right? We created a system so that the different pharmacies like Walgreens are interconnected digitally. So somebody who's got a prescription for opioids can't go from store to store to store refilling that prescription and then, give the pills or, give the opioids to their friends or sell them. It's more often what was happening. We changed the way we prescribe opioids to patients. It's funny, when you get aware of this stuff, you look at it, I had got a dental implant a few years ago, right when we were going through this, probably 5 or 6 years ago, and the doctor gave me a prescription for an opioid and said, all right, take, 3 of these a day and see how you're feeling. Call me if you still got pain in 4 days. And yet he gave me 30 days worth of the prescription. So all of a sudden I've got all this, all this opioid in my medicine cabinet. So when I actually went through and we created safe days for people to dispose of all those excess opioids, but I had 65 pills in my medicine cabinet from 3 or 4 different prescriptions. So you deal with that. But one thing we did, and Colorado did it, and I think we're at 46 states, we sued the pharmaceutical companies who had been promoting and marketing these opioids as relatively harmless and miracle pain relievers. And I think, the courts will find out, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that they fully understood the risks involved and did nothing. And I feel like we did so much, and yet I still see the statistics out there, and we've got a long way to go. I mean, this is addiction. If you've been through it with somebody who's really trying to beat addiction, it is one of the hardest things not just for the person who's fighting addiction, but for their closest friends and their family.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, speaking about safe disposal, do you support a gun buyback program?
I was wondering where you're going to go with that. Nuclear waste, I didn't know. So I support everything we can do to reduce gun violence. We're at the point now where we have just about 1 mass shooting a day, right? It's 6.5 or 6.6 mass shootings a week. Think about that. I mean, how is it that Washington can't get anything done around this? Why is it, we passed universal background checks in Colorado, right? Purple state, right? We got it passed. It was a battle. I can go into the details. And yet Washington, and Cory Gardner's not sure they really work and doesn't think it should be discussed on the floor. The votes are in the Senate for universal background checks. There are enough Republicans there that are ready to vote for it, and yet Mitch McConnell won't let it come to the floor. And it's beyond me. If you were someone who hated America and wanted to harm this country, what would be a better way to harm this country than to make kids afraid to go to school so they didn't learn, or make neighborhoods, friends, families afraid to go worship together, or to go out to a nightclub and enjoy an evening with their neighbors? I mean, to make us afraid to do the basic things that bring us together in life is a form of terrorism that we're allowing to be inflicted on ourselves. So now, in this country, gun buybacks haven't been shown to be effective. They have been, I think, in Australia and maybe one other country. I think we should look at it and figure out how do we make one effective and useful that we can go out and do it. But I want to do everything we can to reduce gun violence, but I don't want to go out and spend money that's not going to actually move the ball, or if it's going to create more harm, more problems than it solves.
Well, more on that issue, do you suggest any legislation that will be tougher on firearm?
Well, I think that this endless debate over universal background checks. And I'll tell you the story that is, it's a little too illuminative. Is that a word? Illuminative? Yes. A little bit too illuminative about my family. So when we were fighting over universal background checks in Colorado, my son Teddy, who's now a senior in high school, trying to decide where he's going to go to college, so I don't think I'm every bit as scared as your parents are. But Teddy at that time was in 5th grade. And I came home in the middle of this universal background checks battle, and I made the mistake of complaining to Teddy. It's a big mistake. Never complain to a 10-year-old. And he looks at me and goes, Dad, what do you do at work all day that's just so hard? Make decisions? I said, well, Teddy, it's not that easy. Teddy, he goes, Dad, get the facts, make a decision, check, next. I go, well, Teddy, come on, now you got to be kidding. Teddy goes, no, Dad, get the facts, make a decision, check, next. He goes, every day I have to go into school and learn something completely new I didn't even know existed the day before. If I don't get it perfectly, my next day is misery because everything's based on the day before. I mean, after 5 minutes I said, you're right, Teddy, 5th grade is harder than being governor. I get it. But I went into work the next day and I realized we had the national statistics and we did not have the local statistics on whether background checks were succeeding. All the Republicans were saying, well, crooks aren't stupid. They're not going to get a background check. Why are the rest of us having to wait around and wait 10 minutes and spend $10 to buy a new hunting rifle? And so we were getting, like every state, because of the federal laws, we were doing background checks on the guns that were bought at the big stores, right? So we were getting to roughly 50 or 60% of the gun purchases. So I said, let's get our state statistics. And I've memorized these statistics. On my deathbed, I will be rattling off. And these are the statistics of who we apprehended trying to buy a gun in 2012. And this is only 50% of the people who wanted to buy a gun actually applied to get background checks. 38 people in 2012 in Colorado, right? 5.5 million people. 38 people convicted of homicide tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. 133 people convicted of sexual assault tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. In all, there were 3,000 people, convicted felons, right? Felony assault and battering, felony assault, all these violent crimes. 3,000 people tried to buy guns, and we stopped them. There were 420 people who had a judicial restraining order, not to see their ex-spouse or their ex-boss. They tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. And just in case you don't think crooks are that stupid, right? 240 people, when they came to pick up their new gun, we arrested them for an outstanding warrant for a violent crime, right? So if you want my advice on how to go about this, you start going to some of these purple states and some of the red states. Because when we went through this battle, we didn't get those statistics until after we already passed the legislation, right? It took 3.5 weeks for the Department of Public Safety to go through all the data and pull that out. Up until that point, a number of Republicans said, well, we're going to recall your Democratic senators, which they did. The Democrats lost the majority. And we're going to repeal this nonsense of universal background checks. Once those statistics came out, I have never heard a single Republican talk about repeal, right? And I think once you have statistics like that from your own city, your own state, about who's trying to buy guns and getting stopped, and then realizing that there's another 50% double that number of people that are trying to buy guns and are buying the guns, I think that breeds a breath of reality that any politician can't ignore.
All right. Okay, I think we might have time for one more question.
Okay.
Do you support Medicare for all? So it's a small question.
You're taking me back to my debate days. I will say that I will just say as an aside that running for president it's a bucket list thing. It's one of the most exciting things I've ever done. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I obviously didn't get the traction I was thinking. I kept saying, but wait a second, we got to near universal health care coverage in Colorado. We passed universal background checks. We've got the best climate change program in the country. I mean, I'm the one guy who's done all these things everyone else is talking about. And they look at me and they go, okay, next. This is not a year anybody cared about that. But as I say to my wife, Robin, all the time, I did get to 2%. Just want that framed away. I have, since I was a kid, believed in that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. That everyone has a right to public access of healthcare. When I was in college, same age as many of you, I helped a friend of mine, Mark Maselli, start a community health center in Middletown, Connecticut in 1973, which I'm happy to say he is still running. It is now 220 locations. And sliding scale, no one has ever turned away everyone can get access to health care. I think that Medicare for all, I think there's a better way to get to the same outcome. That would require somewhere between 160 and 180 million Americans to give up their private insurance to make this switch. And a lot of them hate private insurance, but a lot of them don't. And again, many of the families that are unionized workers, especially through the Rust Belt, they negotiate lower wages to get a better healthcare plan. And we kind of be pushing them to buy into Medicare. So what I've said, and I said when I was running for president, I say it now, I think there has to be a public option, right? We got to 94.5% coverage in Colorado. But to get to universal coverage, you're going to need some sort of a public option. It should have a sliding scale. It should be some form of something like Medicare or Medicare Advantage, which allows you to use and allows doctors to get compensated for telemedicine, which is very important if you're trying to really expand healthcare to the rural parts of this country. And I think that, the argument, I think if that public option, if people can buy in, let's say that people can't afford to get insurance on the exchange, or they've got a pre-existing condition that makes it more difficult or challenging, that they would be able to opt in and buy this, hybrid Medicare Advantage. And if we do a good enough job, as more people buy into it, it'll grow and the cost will come down and the quality will improve, which will make it more attractive. More people will buy in. Again, as it expands, the cost should come down, the quality should improve, and ultimately more people will flow into it. You could end up in a single-payer system, but it would be an evolution and not a revolution. And I think that's I think that's allowing Americans respond better when they have choices and they can choose things rather than having things taken away from them. So I support the ultimate goal of getting to a less expensive, totally accessible healthcare system. I mean, that's the other side of that question that often doesn't get answered is, why is it that the US government is the one industrialized government in the world that isn't allowed to negotiate for bulk discounts for prescription drugs in the Medicare system? It's nuts, right? And it could be fixed legislatively. Now, Cory Gardner and Mitch McConnell, those guys are all, we Democrats don't take any corporate PAC money, just for the record. Just laying that out there. You won't hear, I don't think you'll hear Cory Gardner talking about PACs. I mean, he was provided $4 million worth of support from the NRA. Of course he's not going to support universal background checks. They're against it. Same thing in terms of taking the drug companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and just making them compromise to the point where our country gets what every other country gets. Why is it that the clinics and hospitals don't provide more transparency so that you can click on your cell phone and given your healthcare plan, you can see what it's going to cost you, right? If you're taking your kid there to get their tonsils out or you're getting stitches removed, you should know what it's going to cost and what your copay is going to be. And that's not so much, I don't think that's impossible to get to if you bring everybody to the table. Use what I call the Colorado approach. Anyway.
Well, that wraps up all the questions that we have for you. Thank you again, former Governor Hickenlooper, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and the floor is yours for any closing remarks.
Well, I get so wrapped up in the questions, I forget to be prepared for a closing. First, I meant what I said is that the students in the room, and I guess in a way we're all students, that you are the future, not just of the state, but of the country. And I think it's a fair argument that my generation, the baby boomers, have left you a boatload of challenges. And I remember, just as a framing a point of view, in 1969, in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, I went to the first Earth Day. And we were the young people. And we were marching on Washington. And we were so excited that we weren't going to put up with the old way of doing things. And yet our system is amazingly difficult to change. And if you go back over those, all those years, and it's just about 50 years now, I think this is, was this the 50th anniversary? I think it was. Maybe it's next year. There's a reason why there's still so many challenges, and part of it is just the powers or the attractions and powers of lobbyists and how powerful and successful they are, how highly compensated they are. I think we've got to have an independent voice in Washington, and that's one of the big reasons why I'm not taking any PAC money. I want to take that experience of local government and state government and translate that into making laws that are simpler, more basic and more fair, and really do begin to address these huge challenges that we're facing day in and day out in our everyday lives. A lot of people don't think it's possible that Washington's too corrupt and too broken. And I don't buy that. When I first ran for mayor, everybody thought it was, I was at 4% week after week after week. Nobody thought I had a snowball's chance in hell that I was ever going to win. And I had all these young volunteers, and I hope some of you will volunteer. Where's Chris? Chris, you back there somewhere?
Chris is outside.
Oh, Chris is outside that door? So Chris is an alum of Metro State, just so you know. And I would encourage you to sign up and volunteer, because this is going to be a grassroots campaign. We're going to need as many volunteers as we can possibly find. But when I try to get my volunteers when I was running for mayor to keep up the energy, I found this clipping in the old Denver Post about a professor of public speaking at the University of Wyoming up in Laramie. And the professor was talking about the importance of using opposites when you speak publicly. If you use opposites, you create emotional impact. And she asked her class, what's the opposite of despair? And a kid raised their hand and goes, joy. She goes, exactly. You want to feel despair, use joy in the same sentence. The words gain emotional impact. And then she asked, what's the opposite of, what's the opposite of woe? And a kid way in the back goes, giddy up. And whenever anybody tells me stuff is impossible, in most cases in life, the opposite of woe is to giddy up. So I'm hopeful that you will help me giddy up to Washington and turn that place around. Our U.S. Senate was meant to be the most important deliberative body on earth. That's what it used to be. I think we need to remake it that way. Thank you. Oh, thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I especially want to say thank you to the students. This is a
All
really
good.
important
All
year.
good.
It's an election year, as you know. And a lot of people are really negative about politics. They've been negative about politics for decades now. And I think this is what it takes to make a strong democracy. People coming out, people engaging, people being brave enough to keep running for office. So thank you for being here today, and thanks everybody for coming. Thanks you guys for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.